Rooted Together podcast, a podcast which aims to root you in Christ through his word together. I'm your host, Charles, and today we are in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob is going to meet Esau. It has been many, many years since the last time the two brothers met, and of course, they left on not the best of terms. If you remember just a few chapters ago, Jacob had tricked Esau and Isaac, his father, out of the birthright and then ran off because Esau was pretty much mad enough to kill Jacob. And after many years and Jacob learning some really hard lessons by being tricked himself into marrying the wrong person, and then working another 7 years to get the person that he wanted to begin with, Jacob is returning. Why? Because God had called him to. This chapter is one of those foundational chapters. It is a very strange chapter because God will, through an angel, will wrestle with Jacob, and it brings about some interesting questions. But what we want to get to quickly is who wins. Jacob, at the end of this chapter, is scheming. Can I strategically divide my camp in case he attacks one, the others can get away? And he's scheming like he always does. Or is our standard for safety and protection and reconciliation actually in the sovereign hands of God? And those are the things that are at play here as Jacob goes to meet Esau. So it says in verse 1, Jacob went on his way and God's angels met him. And when he saw these angels, Jacob said, "This is God's camp." And so they called this place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir and the territory of Edom. That would be his kingdom, as it were, or what will become his kingdom. And basically, through sending his people ahead of him, he's scheming. Like, can I appease Esau? And which brings about questions. Is Jacob genuinely sorry? Is this a genuine attempt at reconciliation or just an attempt for appeasement, like, don't kill me, here's some gifts? And he's sending people ahead, and he's sending all these gifts ahead because he's trying to win the favor of his brother. He doesn't want Esau to carry out the threat that he made chapters ago, decades ago in the time of the story. And he's scheming. This is all a scheme. This is all his way to try to appease Esau. Now, it may be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. We don't know. We're not given Jacob's heart here in terms of, is this genuine or is he just trying to deceive his brother again or simply just appease his brother? We don't know, but we do know he is trying to win his brother's favor through his own way. And there is that self-reliance coming through again. And that has been Jacob's story. And really, an even older story, if you go back into even Abraham, there's this theme of self-reliance. And before we jump into the actual story, we have to stop and ask, why is Moses telling the children of Israel on the plains of Moab, preparing to go into the promised land, this story with the same theme that all the other stories have had? Self-reliance gets you nowhere. God's sovereignty takes you everywhere he wants you to go. That it is God who will win the day, not your self-reliance, not your scheming, not your devising, but it is God's hand that will get you through. Well, he told those stories about Abraham because Abraham tried to do things on his own, through his own scheming. So did Jacob, and so will Israel. Because here's the theme. This is going to outline Israel and their relationship with God into the future, and it also mirrors our relationship with God. How often do we find ourselves scheming and trying the self-reliance gospel, or God will invoke you after all we can do. Like, let me try my scheme first, and then if that doesn't work, then I'll fall back on your plan. Instead of realizing that it is God's sovereign hand that gets things done. You see what Jacob is doing here and what he has done in the past and what he will continue to do into the future, and what Israel will do, is what we struggle with. We struggle with the question and the collision of self-reliance and God's sovereignty. We are happy to admit God is sovereign. And yet, in our lives, we're very quick to say, well, yeah, God is sovereign, but yeah, I know God is sovereign, but I need to do it this way. I think I can get it done this way. And if you're wanting a picture of what that self-reliance looks like, instead of relying on God's sovereignty, skip on down to verse 20. Jacob is talking to his servants. And then the author gives a little behind the scenes, behind the curtain here. We get Jacob's thoughts, what he's really thinking, why he's doing what he's doing. It says, for he thought, I want to appease Esau with the gift that is going ahead of me. And after that, after he is appeased with the gifts, I can face him, and perhaps, maybe, he will forgive me. Jacob's plan for reconciliation isn't to rely on God's call for him to return, God's call for him to go back to his father's land, to see his brother and to see his father again. God had given him that command, and if God gives you that command, he will carry it out. But Jacob's scheming. Maybe if I appease him, then he'll forgive me. So he sends the gifts ahead. He's relying on his scheming. He's relying on his gifts, the things that God had given him, by the way, but he's relying on those things. But in verse 24, the story shifts because God enters the picture. And this is the meat of the story. This is the highlight of this chapter. Verse 24, Jacob was left alone after all his scheming and sending people to strategic locations. And a man, it just says a man, wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. And then Jacob said, let me go, for it is daybreak. Or the man said to Jacob, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And then he says, what is your name? The man asked. And Jacob, he replied, your name will no longer be Jacob. It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. So before we continue that story, we have some interesting things. Like suddenly, after all the scheming, he's like settling down for the night. He was left alone, and there's this man. And we would probably say that was actually an angel, but it's referred to, I guess, in human form. The angel appears as a human, and he wrestles with Jacob. And this kind of odd story. And Jacob decides he's just going to fight it out. Like he's like, bless me or die. I'm going to be blessed or I'm going to die trying. And he just will not let go of this guy. Jacob will not stop. He is stubborn, and his stubbornness is coming out in this wrestling match until finally the guy breaks his hip socket. And for the rest of his life, Jacob will walk with a limp because of this moment. And then the man says, what's your name? And he says, Jacob. And then he says, no, your name will now be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with man, and you've prevailed. Now, that brings about several questions. One, did this angel not know his name? Of course he did. But the point of asking, what is your name, was so that he could change it. And the name change is important, and we'll get into that. But the other question that is brought up is, did he really prevail over God in a wrestling match? And the answer again is no. That's not what's meant here. It's the fact that this wrestling match highlights Jacob's stubbornness, both good and bad. He desires blessing, and he's willing to hold on and to fight to the death for it. And God changes his name to mean you struggle with God, both good and bad. You wrestle with God. Israel, on the plains of Moab, getting ready to go into the promised land, will struggle with God. They will be stubborn. So the name is indicative of their personality as well. It is a group identity, if you were. And so Jacob has been given this name that is a group identity, but I don't think that he was legitimately winning a wrestling match with God. I don't think that's what the text is trying to say. But notice the finer details. His hip socket was broken. He's given a new name, a new identity. And he continues, and he says this, Jacob named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. And he said, yet my life has been spared. Jacob realizes that he didn't win because he was just strong. He won because God spared him. Or he didn't die because God had spared him. That he could have won the fight. He could have destroyed Jacob. I mean, after all he had to do was touch his hip socket and it popped out. He realizes that God had mercy on him. And the sun shone on him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. That is why still today, the Israelites don't eat the thigh muscle that is in the hip socket, because he struck Jacob's hip socket at the thigh muscle. It's kind of an interesting little Added note by whoever was compiling Genesis after Moses wrote it. I don't think Moses wrote that part. I think this is actually a later addition by a scribe, that last little verse, 32. And you have these throughout Genesis, that whoever compiled Moses' writings added in a few little details like that. And you see that anytime it says things like, and it's still called this name to this day. Well, obviously to this day was the day of the readers. And at this time, Moses is not necessarily writing. He's writing this story, but he's also telling it to Israel on the plains of Moab. He's sending them with these writings into the promised land, though he himself will not go. The point of this is this, that Jacob, who was scheming the entire chapter, he schemed his entire life. And yet what's going to be ironic as we move forward, it is in his brokenness, in the fact that he is hurt with a hurt hip, that he will finally realize that it is God who wins, that it is God who spares, and that it is God's whose sovereign hand will guide him through what he is facing. It isn't his scheming that will allow Esau to not kill him. It is God's hand on him. If God had spared him in that wrestling match, God will spare him at the hands of Esau as well. Whether Esau tries to fight or not, God will win, because he has placed on Jacob, even in his brokenness, a sign that I am with you in your brokenness. And what a beautiful thing for us to grasp, that in our scheming and in our fallenness, in our brokenness, is God's hand shown more clearly. We're not going to be able to scheme our way to victory, but it is in realizing that we are broken spiritually. And when we hand that to God, it is then that we find true peace. It is then that we find true joy, and we find true fulfillment in all that we are doing, not because we're scheming it out, trying to win it for ourselves, but because we've handed it over to God, to realize that God spares us. God guides us. His hand is on us. It took Jacob in a very painful wrestling match to realize that. And often for us, it takes the pain of life's classroom for us to learn these lessons, that it is in our brokenness that God acts. And that isn't when we realize we are broken and we are not enough, that we hand our lives over to God to let his sovereign hand guide us and propel us forward. Thank you for joining me in Genesis 32. I look forward to joining you in Genesis 33 next time. I'll see you there.